All right, our final question for tonight is a question regarding the modification of our Sunday services that we've been doing over the past few weeks here because of the pandemic of the coronavirus. And so clearly things are not normal. We have altered the format in which we meet together to worship God on the first day of the week. And I guess we're doing it also on Sunday nights, on Wednesday nights, and on Thursday mornings for our Bible class. And so there's been a question that's been posed. One of our young people sent me an article. And the background, of course, is because the elders here are trying our best to navigate a dilemma between the need to meet together on the first day of the week, as the New Testament pattern shows, and, on the other hand, the need to protect the flock and to protect our elderly member and those who are vulnerable from a pandemic that requires social distancing, they call it. So those two are in conflict, coming together and distancing socially. And so it is a dilemma that needs to be navigated, and the elders have chosen to modify our meetings to try to navigate that particular dilemma. Now, I'm not claiming that everything is perfect the way it is at the moment, but we are striving to be faithful. But many brethren have taken exception to the church's change in a long-standing tradition of having open, congregation-wide worship assembly on Sundays to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, I can appreciate anyone's concern over the reasons that we do what we do, and we're supposed to be concerned for that. But I've seen some among us being immature in their attitudes, divisive in their actions, and infantile in their reasoning. Some are obviously worse than others. But the article that was sent to me is an article that takes issue with our deviation from full and open assemblies on the first day of the week. But it was more level-headed than most. It was more thoughtful than most. And therefore, it does merit a response in the same spirit that it was written. And so in this response, I'll probably be doing a lot of reading, as I already have, because that's the only way to keep me on track, because I'll go for another hour. But suffice it to say that the basic thesis of the entire piece was, upon what authority? By what authority do men suspend the Lord's Day assembly? That's what it said right there in the thesis statement in the body of his article. Upon what authority do men suspend the Lord's Day assembly? Now, of course, my first response to that is we're not suspending it. We're not. We're modifying it, but we're still meeting it, in my opinion. And I believe I can argue that case. But I believe, of course, that the background of that question and his response to what I would say about that would be, no, by what authority do men suspend the open, the physically proximate fellowship of all the brethren who've come together on the first day of the week in the same room, which I'm sure is what the point is. And that's the underlying assumption of his entire article, that the only way to accomplish a meeting together on the first day of the week is by being in the same room. And of course, appeal is made to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 as a pattern. And often he speaks of the command to come together in one place. So even if we did suspend that, which is what we have done here for the most part, though not entirely, I believe the elders would still have the authority because they are charged by God's authority to protect the flock. And so, by what authority? Well, it's the same authority that's behind Jesus' statement in Matthew 23 and verse 23 that says you tithe cumin and mint and anise, and you have no regard for the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. Jesus here is clearly saying there is a priority that can be made and that must be recognized by those who would be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And again, he goes on to say, these ye ought to have done and not left the others undone. And we have not left the others undone, as I would argue. And yet we are certainly trying to protect those who are more vulnerable among us and not bring them into unnecessary danger. And so it's by the authority of God inherent in the responsibility to love your neighbor, when that requires a modification of pattern ritual. That is, first day gatherings in a single location. Now, I think it's important for us to think clearly about the language we would use when we say God commands us to come together in the same physical location on the first day of the week. I would like to see a command in the Bible that says that. I do not deny that that's the pattern. And I do not deny that that is the ideal. And that that is what God wants. And that there are good reasons for God wanting that, because He wants us to be together and love one another and be involved in one another's life and grow together. And I don't believe that anyone, of course, is denying that. But I think it's important for us to understand that to say that God commands it, maybe the statement could be made, but we need to better understand what we mean when we say that. I told you I was going to be reading more, didn't I? But I kind of stopped reading. Let me start reading again. While the pattern is clearly a Sunday worship gathering for partaking of the Lord's Supper, this shouldn't be viewed as merely a command, any more than our responsibility to love our spouses should be viewed merely as a command. Strictly speaking, love cannot be commanded anyway. Neither can heartfelt worship. But we can cultivate what can't be commanded. God has given us the pattern of regular meetings as a platform through which to continually cultivate love for our brethren and special nuances of worship. Worship that we can't enjoy on our own. No one doubts that. And so the pattern of the Lord's Day assembly should be viewed as normative and ideal, certainly, but always in the service of our relationship to God and not vice versa. Never should it be viewed as if our Christianity is in service to the Sunday assembly. And I believe this is what Jesus points out forcefully in many texts when He deals with the Pharisaical attitude about profaning the Sabbath. Because the Pharisees were quick to uphold formal and traditional observances of the Sabbath, and when they saw Jesus doing things that transgressed these formal and traditional observances, they were offended and believed Jesus was in sin. But His words are very instructive and helps us as a corrective to view the first day of the week assembly correctly too. Now, I'm not saying that the first day of the week is exactly analogous to the Sabbath day, but it is a special day that we read about in the pattern of the New Testament that has special connections to Christian worship and Christian activity. But I want to look at just a few of these passages to show the point, I believe, clearly. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. It says, He entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand, and they watched him closely whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him. And so if Jesus does any kind of work to aid and help this man, in their opinion, he would be violating the Sabbath. He said to the man who had a withered hand, Step forward, and he turned to them and said, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Which is it? But they kept silent. Jesus here is saying, if I see this man in need and I neglect him because I'm trying to keep a formal observance of traditional Sabbath rules, I am actually doing evil. And I am actually, in a sense, letting him die. Because I'm doing nothing to help him. But isn't it lawful to do good and to preserve life on the Sabbath day? And that's his point. They kept silent because really they're just trying to trap him and be able to accuse him by some logical machination here. In verse 5, when he had looked around on them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And so he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. And the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. And I believe in a lot of ways this is unfortunately the same mentality of some of our brethren. I don't know that they realize it, I hope that some of them will, if they do fit this description. But I know that this is a principle that Jesus is teaching us. Another one that's very important is Matthew chapter 12, where Jesus' disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath day as they walk through the cornfield. And the Pharisees see it, Matthew 12, verse 2, and say to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. And then he begins to point out examples where they are exalting the rules and regulations of a Sabbath day above the weightier matters of the law, is essentially what he's saying there. David is an example because his men were in need of something that they went and ate of the bread that was not supposed to be eating. According to the law of Moses, no one could eat that bread except for the priest. But yet David's men went in and ate it, and he was guiltless. In verse 6, he says, I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. That's speaking of himself. And so you should have known what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And if you knew that, you would not have condemned the guiltless. These are powerful passages that show Jesus pointing out that a person's faulty understanding of what they perceive of as a command that is inviolable, in the same vein as the command not to commit murder or not to commit fornication, is blinding them to the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. And so the problem with this kind of thinking, as I believe is in the background of this man's article, is the danger of exalting a formal element of Christianity over wisdom and prudence in serving the Lord acceptably. And Jesus called out the religious leaders of this as well. In reality, I think we all understand this principle to a certain degree. We just fail to apply it consistently. There are extenuating circumstances we all would agree that would prevent the meeting of the saints, for sickness' sake and for safety's sake. And we have all done it from time to time. Perhaps we're unable through sickness, or perhaps we are undesirable. We do not desire to meet because we don't want to get others sick. Now, this would, of course, include the current situation. And so a quick statement with regard to the governing authorities, because this is also prominent in his article. Our modification of public services is in no way out of fear or cowardice before government authority. Again, we're choosing to do this because we believe the medical professionals who are warning us and attempting to warn us about this. Now, we're not medical professionals ourselves. I don't know how accurate all of that is. How am I supposed to know? I got to go to medical school, I guess. But we're doing what we can do. We've heard much about Acts 5:29. We ought to obey God rather than men. But I would also like to draw our attention to Romans 13:1-4. Be subject to the governing authorities, for they watch out for you. They are there to provide safety and peace and a common platform in order to worship and serve God. And I believe that that's more in line with what's going on today. The government is in no way attempting to persecute Christianity or squelch the gospel. Instead, it's quite to the contrary. They're trying to protect all citizens, including Christians. The authorities are not mandating against the worship of God. They are only giving guidelines and mandates that place restrictions on public gatherings at church buildings and so forth. I could go on and on and on. Like I said, I've got a lot of notes here, but I'm trying to cover the big ideas. Now, I just want to conclude by reading the rest of this. Again, we're not forbidding and we're not discouraging the worship of God. In fact, we're trying to provide an opportunity for us all still to meet together in a virtual space, much like the people in the first century did over the Lord's Supper. As we pointed out this morning, Paul in Ephesus and the Corinthians in Achaia could partake of the same body by virtue or virtually by means of the Lord's Supper. We are providing the Lord's Supper elements and songbooks for our members, as well as live streaming of services, and utilizing current technology in order to meet the need of the congregation. We believe that this is in the best interest of all involved, and we believe the medical professionals have the best interest of the public in mind for the most part. We believe that God's people should be seen cooperating with reasonable efforts to help reduce the spread of the coronavirus. Would Christianity demand any different? To work against this effort in order to uphold a ritual would arguably be both unbiblical and ungodly. Having said all of that, we also believe that it's unfaithful to go to the extreme of simply wringing our hands of the situation and doing nothing to keep the church together. Some congregations do consist solely or primarily of older members, and they have no resources to utilize today's technology as an aid, and that's very unfortunate. But there are some who are simply failing through a lack of spiritual maturity, a lack of godly fear, and a lack of brotherly love. Every faithful congregation of God's people should some way be attempting to meet this challenge that's before us. And if we cross our arms and close the doors and essentially cease to exist as a body of believers because of this challenge, I believe that we are only exposing a deadness and a lifelessness and a ritualism that has been festering all along under a falsely called Christianity. Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 5 says, "If you have run with the footmen and they have wearied you, how will you contend with the horses?" This is a pandemic, a viral outbreak in the world, and we have the government actually trying to help us. What are we going to do when the government does actually try to persecute us? And then we have to stand for Jesus at the point or at the threat of arrest or imprisonment or death. This is a minor thing compared to that, isn't it? And so I know that Steve and Dennis and I, we want to do what's right. We're not perfect, but I know that we want to be faithful. And I know that our brethren here have been amazing through all of this. And again, the fact that we have some of our older members who are just unable, they don't have the technology, they don't have the know-how to be able to tune in, and it's just not safe to go over to their house. And I don't know, maybe there's a way to think about it and figure it out, but that's the challenge before us. But as Paul would say, as God is my witness, as God is our witness, we're not going to give up through this. We're going to stay faithful to God because He's worthy. And we're thankful for that, and we're grateful for